5 years of silence taught Victoria how a marriage dies without anyone raising their voice. She had expected betrayal to arrive like a blade, sudden, visible, something she could point to and say, "There, that is where it broke." Instead, it arrived the way frost arrives, quietly, overnight. By the time she noticed, the damage had already set into the bone of the house. She gave him another woman with her own hands, believing she was saving her marriage. She did not yet know she was arming the woman who would try to take it. A child not born of her body would secure her husband's name, his title, his line, and unmake everything she had spent 5 years believing about who he was, who she was, and what a wife is permitted to sacrifice before sacrifice becomes surrender. This is not a story about a man choosing between two women. It is a story about a woman who chose first, and spent the rest of her life discovering what that choice had truly cost her. Welcome to Velvet Duke Romance Library. Like and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's begin. The ballroom at Castellan Hall had been built for exactly this kind of evening. Ceilings high enough to swallow whispers whole, candlelight arranged to flatter every face but hers tonight, it seemed, no matter where Victoria stood. She had learned, over 5 winters, how to hold herself in rooms like this, spine long, chin level, hands folded over the pearl embroidery at her waist, as though stillness were a skill rather than a defense. The ivory of her gown caught the chandelier light and threw it back softer than gold, and for a moment, crossing the floor on Alexander's arm, she almost believed the evening might pass without incident. Lady Pemberton's voice found her from across the room, pitched just loud enough to carry, "Forgive me, Your Grace. I hadn't realized you were already so far along." The words weren't aimed at Victoria. They never were. They landed on the Duchess of Harrow, 3 months pregnant in pale blue silk, who flushed with pretty embarrassment and touched her own stomach, as if surprised to be reminded of it. A small crowd gathered the way crowds gather around warmth in winter. Victoria kept walking. Beside her, Alexander's pace didn't change. That was the cruelty of it. Not unkindness, never that, but a steadiness that asked nothing of the room and gave it nothing either. His hand rested at the small of her back, correct and unhurried. "You needn't slow for me," she said, low enough that only he would hear it. "I wasn't aware I had. You always do." Near her, she didn't look at the Duchess of Harrow when she said it. She didn't need to. Alexander's jaw shifted, the smallest fraction, the only place his composure ever showed a hairline crack. He offered nothing further. 5 years had taught Victoria that his silences carried different weights, and this one settled with the density of a man choosing not to defend himself, because defending himself would mean admitting the accusation had landed somewhere true. They reached the far end of the room, where the fire threw long shadows up the stone, and his hand pressed slightly firmer against her back, as if to say, "I see what this costs you," without once saying it aloud. She let herself hold on to that pressure longer than the moment warranted. It didn't last. A footman appeared at Alexander's elbow with a folded note, and whatever had softened in him hardened back into the shape of duty. He excused himself toward the card room. Victoria did not follow. She had learned the architecture of the house, which corridors connected the ballroom's warmth to the colder passage skirting the library. It was there, half lit by a single sconce, that she found herself standing with a glass of wine she had no intention of finishing. The voices reached her before she saw the men attached to them. 5 years, Crawford. 5. You cannot build a house on a foundation that refuses to set. The Duke has been remarkably tolerant, a second, drier voice answered. More tolerant than his father would have been, I'll wager. Tolerance isn't governance. The southern houses are already circling. If Lord Ashworth's daughter were brought forward as a formal proposal before the council, Half this room would sign their names to it before the ink dried. Victoria's grip on the glass stem did not change. Her breath did not change. Only something behind her ribs, something that had held very still for a very long time, turned over once, slow and sick, like a stone shifting at the bottom of a riverbed. The Duke won't entertain it. Not yet. Not yet, the first voice agreed, gentle the way a man is gentle delivering news he believes is kind, but yet is not forever. A title without an heir is a door standing open. Someone will walk through it, Crawford, whether the Duke holds it shut himself or not. A door, somewhere down the passage, opened and closed. Footsteps receded. Victoria set the glass down on the windowsill, steadier than she felt. 5 years. She had counted every one of them in smaller units than years, in months that came and went with nothing to show for them, in the look on her physician's face that had stopped being sympathetic and started being merely professional. She had told herself, every one of those months, that Alexander's patience was proof of something. She understood now, standing in a cold passage with an untouched glass of wine, that patience and indifference could wear the same coat. The music swelled again through the wall. Victoria smoothed the front of her gown with both gloved hands. An old habit, less about the fabric than about giving her hands something to do that wasn't shaking. She walked back into the ballroom with her chin exactly where it had been all evening, and stepped through the doors just as Alexander reappeared, his eyes finding hers across the floor with a directness that, for one unguarded second, looked almost like a man checking whether something he valued was still where he'd left it. She smiled at him the way the room expected her to. He did not yet know what she had heard, only that after 5 years of careful, patient waiting, she had stopped waiting to be saved by him and started, instead, calculating how to save herself. Alexander found her at her writing desk an hour before noon, an unusual time for him to seek her chambers. He stood near the hearth with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture he wore when bracing for a conversation rather than beginning one's comfortably. You left the ballroom early last night. I left the passage early. The ballroom I returned to. She set down her pen. I heard a great deal, most of it about a young woman I've never met, and a door someone seems eager to walk through. Tell me I misunderstood. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence told her everything the words would have. The council has discussed contingencies. They discuss contingencies for everything. It is what councils are for. Contingencies have names now. Lord Ashworth's daughter has a name. Does that strike you as a contingency, or a candidate? It strikes me as men talking in a card room who do not speak for me. Not yet. She heard her own voice say it before she'd decided to. That's what they said. Not yet. He crossed the room toward her, crouched beside her chair, so that he no longer stood over her, and reached for her hand. Not the practiced courtesy of a husband steering her through a crowd, but something slower, his thumb tracing once along the inside of her wrist where her glove ended, as though checking for a pulse he half feared wouldn't answer. I have given them no answer, he said. I will give them none, not while I have a wife. And if you no longer do, his jaw tightened, then I suppose I will have failed you in every way a man can fail the woman he married. It was the most honest touch he'd given her in over a year, and it told her precisely how frightened he was beneath the stillness. She let her hand stay in his a moment longer than pride should have allowed, then drew it back, because there was nothing more dangerous to her resolve than mistaking comfort for a solution. She found Rose in the linen room an hour later, sleeves rolled to the elbow, auburn hair coming loose, humming over a stack of sheets. Victoria had not chosen Rose the way one chooses a servant. Rose had simply been there for as long as memory served. A girl 5 years younger, brought into the household as a child when her own mother had died in service to the Beaumonts, raised in the nursery wing, alongside lessons Victoria had insisted she share. Victoria had taught her these things not from duty, but from something closer to loneliness answered. An only daughter given, almost by accident. A sister, you're staring. Either you've folded something wrong, or I've had a worse morning than usual. Rose's teasing dropped immediately at whatever she saw in Victoria's face, replaced with the old, careful attentiveness she'd had since girlhood. Tell me, Victoria told her some of it. The council, Lord Ashworth's daughter, the door standing open. She didn't tell her the shape already forming in her own mind, a shape she hadn't given permission to exist, and yet found, disturbingly, already fully formed. They can't simply replace a duchess. Surely there's law in this. There's law for everything. Law bends for an empty cradle faster than for almost anything else. Victoria sat on the edge of the table, suddenly tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. I keep thinking there must be some other way, some solution that doesn't end with my husband's name beside a stranger's. Rose was quiet a moment, folding the same sheet she'd already folded, smoothing a crease that wasn't there. What kind of solution? Victoria didn't answer. She hadn't let herself answer, even alone, even at 3 a.m. with the fire long since burned to embers, because answering meant admitting the thought had a shape, and the shape had Rose's face in it, and naming that out loud felt like a door she could not, once opened, ever fully close again. Nothing, she said, nothing yet. Rose studied her a moment too long, then smiled, and reached for another sheet. Whatever it is, you know I'd do almost anything for this house. For you. The word almost should have meant nothing. Victoria did not weigh it. Not that morning. She did not sleep that night. Not properly. She lay turning the idea over the way one turns a stone in a riverbed, examining every face of it for the crack that would prove it unworkable. She did not find one. Rose, who already belonged to the household in every way but blood. Rose, who trusted her absolutely. Rose, who could be protected, controlled, kept close, kept theirs, in a way Lord Ashworth's daughter never could be. It was not love that decided her, in the end. It was arithmetic, cold, exact, the kind of calculation Victoria had spent 5 years learning to despise in the mouths of councilmen, and finding, now, fully at home in her own. She rose before dawn, and walked the east corridor toward Alexander's study. Past generations of Beaumont dukes and their wives painted in the same stillness she had spent 5 years perfecting, as if the whole family had agreed that composure was the only inheritance a woman in this house was guaranteed to keep. The study door was dark oak, banded in iron. She stood before it longer than the walk had taken her to reach it, listening to nothing. She lifted her hand. It hovered an inch from the wood, gloved fingers pale against the dark grain. And for several held breaths, Victoria Beaumont did not knock. She knocked. It cost her more than the decision itself had. The decision had been arithmetic, something she could perform in the dark without an audience. The knock required her body to commit to it, in a way the mind alone never had to. Alexander opened the door himself, still in his shirt sleeves, the midnight coat draped over the back of his chair, a rare undress that made him look, for a moment, less like a duke and more like a man who hadn't slept either. Victoria, not a question, a measurement. The way he spoke her name when trying to determine how much trouble had walked in with her. I need to speak with you, before the household wakes. He stepped back to let her in, closed the door with the same deliberate care he'd used the morning before, and waited. She had rehearsed the words on the walk over and lost every one of them somewhere between the corridor and the threshold, So what came out instead was plainer than she intended. Give them Rose. The silence that followed had texture to it. She could feel it pressing against her ears the way pressure builds before a storm breaks. Say that again, slowly, so I can be certain I haven't misheard you. The arrangement is not unheard of. A discreet. I know what it is, not unheard of. I know precisely what it is, because I watched my father do something near enough to it. And I watched what it did to this family before either of us was old enough to understand what we were witnessing. He turned from her, toward the window. My father brought a woman into this house under a kinder excuse. And for 2 years, my mother smiled at dinner and wept after it, while the woman never wept at all because she had stopped needing to. By the time it ended, my mother had lost her health, her place at this table, and very nearly her life to a fever no physician could explain, and everyone privately understood. I will not build my marriage on the same foundation that nearly buried hers. She hadn't known any of that. In 5 years of marriage, he had told her almost nothing of his father, beyond the portraits and the dates carved into the family Bible. I am not your mother. Rose is not that woman. Rose is a girl who has known nothing in this world except this house, and the kindness you've shown her. You are asking her to give her body to a man she has called your grace, since she was old enough to curtsy, and you are asking it not from a stranger's distance, but from inside the only family she has. He faced her again, and the storm in his eyes had gone quiet, which somehow made it worse. I will not do this to her, and I will not do it to you. Then tell me what you will do. Her voice cracked along an edge she hadn't meant to expose, because the alternative is already being drafted. Alexander. I heard it spoken aloud in a passage 2 nights ago, and I promise you, no one in that conversation was weighing what it would cost Rose, or me, or you. They were weighing a ledger. If you won't choose the lesser cruelty, the council will choose the greater one for you. He offered nothing to that. There was no answer that wasn't a concession, and they both knew it. And the not saying sat between them like a third presence in the room, until Victoria finally let herself out, leaving him standing in his shirt sleeves with his hands flat against the windowsill, staring at a garden he couldn't see in the dark. The council's answer arrived the following morning, sealed in wax and delivered without ceremony by a steward who clearly understood that he was carrying something heavier than parchment. The language was bloodless in the way official language always was. Given the continued absence of issue, the council respectfully requests the Duke's position be formalized within the season. But the meaning underneath required no translation, perhaps 4 months. He found Victoria in the small parlor and set the letter beside her without a word. She read it once and did not ask what he intended. I'll speak to Rose. He didn't argue. That too was its own kind of answer. She found Rose in the nursery wing, mending a tear that didn't need mending so urgently as Rose seemed to be treating it. Victoria sat across from her without preamble and told her everything. The council, the deadline, the door that had been standing open since the night of the ball, and then what she was asking. Rose's needle stilled mid-stitch. You're asking me to save your marriage. Rose's hands stayed exactly where they'd stopped, the unfinished stitch hanging between her fingers like a held breath. I'm asking more than that, and I know it. I'm asking you to give something of yourself that you can't take back to a man who isn't yours, for the sake of a house that has only ever owed you kindness, not this. Victoria reached for her hand. If you say no, I will find another way. I will not let this be the price of loving you. Rose looked at their joined hands for a long moment, something working behind her face that Victoria didn't pause long enough to read. Yes. The word arrived faster than 5 years of careful deliberation should have allowed. I'll do it, Rose, you raised me in this house when you owed me nothing. Let me decide what it costs me to answer." She withdrew her hand, gently, and returned to the needlework. "Truly, I want to help." Victoria left the room lighter than she'd entered it, mistaking relief for resolution, and did not see what happened in the silence after the door closed behind her. Rose set the gown aside. She rose, crossed to the small mirror above the washstand, and studied her own reflection for longer than vanity required. The rounded, youthful face, the light brown eyes that had spent a lifetime being looked past in rooms built for women like Victoria. She practiced an expression in the glass, slow and deliberate, the corners of her mouth lifting into something that was not quite a smile, and not quite anything Victoria would have recognized as gratitude. Yes, the word left her again, softer, meant for no one but the glass in front of her. The household reorganized itself the way households do when everyone has agreed, without saying so aloud, to pretend nothing unusual is occurring. A wing once used for visiting cousins was quietly aired and prepared. Victoria oversaw every detail herself, with the precision of a woman directing her own funeral arrangements. She and Alexander spoke only once more before the night arrived, in the corridor outside her chambers. "You don't have to watch any part of this," he said. "I would spare you that at least." "I know!" She straightened the cuff of her glove, a gesture with no purpose beyond occupying her hands. "I find I would rather know it is happening than imagine it happening worse than it is." He didn't touch her. He had learned, somewhere in the last 2 days, that touch had become a kind of cruelty neither of them could afford anymore. Victoria, her name again, carrying that same unfinished weight it had carried at the study door. "Whatever this becomes, I want you to know I never stopped choosing you, even tonight." She did not trust herself to answer that. She nodded, once, and let him go. Night settled over Castellan Hall the way it always did in deep winter. Early, absolute, pressing against the windows like something with weight. Victoria sat alone in her chambers with a single candle burning low, fully dressed, though there was no one left to dress for, her hands folded in her lap in the same composed stillness she had spent 5 years perfecting for rooms full of strangers. She did not go to the east wing. She did not listen at any door. She sat, instead, counting the candle's slow collapse into wax, as though watching it might somehow anchor her to the version of herself that had walked into this arrangement believing she understood its cost. And then, far down the corridor, muffled by distance and old stone walls, she heard it. A door, closing, not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet, final sound of latch meeting frame, ordinary, in every way, except for what it meant. And for several long minutes afterward, Victoria Beaumont did not move at all, while somewhere beneath the same roof, the thing she had set in motion finally, irrevocably, began. Victoria began counting the morning after, though she never decided to. The number simply arrived in her mind unbidden. 1. The way certain numbers attach themselves to wounds and refuse to be reasoned with. She did not see Alexander for 3 days. He sent word through his valet that council matters required him at the northern estate, which might even have been true, though Victoria had learned enough of marriage to know that distance often called itself by other names when it needed an excuse to exist. Rose returned to her duties within days, moving through the household with the same light step she'd always carried. If anything had changed in her, Victoria could not find it in the ordinary hours of the day. Only, occasionally, a stillness that hadn't been there before, gone again before Victoria could decide whether she'd imagined it. It was in the second week that the first small refusal arrived, dressed so carefully in practicality that Victoria almost mistook it for nothing at all. I've moved my things to the room nearer the east stair, Rose said, folding a shawl over her arm. The old room catches a draft, something terrible this time of year. I thought it best. Given. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. You might have asked, Victoria said, and heard, even as she said it, how thin the objection sounded against the reasonableness of the request. I didn't think it required asking. It's only a room, Rose smiled, easy and unbothered, and reached to adjust a pin that had slipped from Victoria's hair. You've always told me this house was as much mine as anyone's. I took you at your word. Victoria let it pass. The room was, after all, only a room. Closer to the warmth of the kitchens, closer to the wing where Alexander's study sat, closer to 100 small conveniences that meant nothing on their own and everything in aggregate. Though Victoria would not let herself finish that thought either, not yet. By the third week, the counting had become its own quiet architecture inside her days. Alexander returned from the north on the 18th day, thinner around the eyes than he'd left, and asked, with a carefulness that cost him visible effort, how Rose fared. Well enough. She seems herself. And you? The question caught her off guard, precisely because it was so rarely asked anymore. And you? Two words that assumed she still existed as someone separate from the arrangement. I am counting, she said, which was the truest answer she had. He reached out and let his hand rest briefly against the side of her face. Not a caress exactly, something closer to a man confirming, with his palm rather than his eyes, that the woman in front of him was still warm, still present, still his to worry over even now. She leaned into it for the space of a single breath before stepping back. The morning it happened arrived ordinarily enough. Victoria woke before her maid came to dress her and went down to the small breakfast room, expecting to find Rose already there. The room was empty. It took a moment to register as wrong rather than simply unusual. Rose had not missed a morning in this house in 5 years. She found her 2 corridors away, on her knees beside a basin, one hand braced against the cold stone floor, and the other pressed flat to her own cold stomach. Her face, when she lifted it, had gone the color of old linen, damp at the temples. Victoria crossed the room. Rose, how long has this? Since before dawn. Rose's voice came thin, though something underneath it remained startlingly steady. Don't call for the physician yet. Rose, if you are unwell. I am not unwell. The words arrived sharper than Victoria had heard from her in 5 years. Rose closed her eyes, breathed once, and when she opened them again, the sharpness had smoothed beneath something gentler. Though Victoria, kneeling close enough to feel the heat off her skin, did not believe the gentleness had replaced it so much as covered it. Bring me ginger water, not the physician, and close the door behind you. I'd rather the staff didn't see me like this. Victoria rose to fetch it, because there was nothing else, in that moment, that she knew how to do. But she carried with her, down every cold hallway, the unsettling certainty that something in the architecture of their household had just shifted, and that the girl kneeling on the floor behind her had, for the first time in 5 years of grateful deference, simply told her what to do. The physician arrived at midday, under the same quiet protocol that governed every other aspect of the arrangement. No announcement to the wider household, only a man with a leather case instructed to use the servants' entrance, as though Castellan Hall itself had learned to hold its breath. When the door finally opened, the physician's expression told her before his words did. 6 weeks by my estimate, perhaps 7. Strong color, steady pulse. I see no cause for concern, Your Grace, though I'd recommend she rest more than her temperament will likely allow. Victoria returned to find Rose sitting upright against a bank of pillows, her hands resting over her own stomach, with a stillness that hadn't been there the week before. Not quite tenderness, not quite triumph, something held carefully between the two. 6 weeks, Rose said, testing the number against the air. It feels longer than that, somehow, as though I've been carrying this since before it existed. I'll see that you want for nothing. Whatever you need, however long this takes. I know. Rose's fingers curled briefly around hers, then settled back over her own stomach. You've always seen to that. She found Alexander in the study an hour later, standing at the window with his back to the door. She delivered the physician's words plainly, without ornament. He didn't turn immediately. For a long moment he simply stood there. And then, just before he faced her, something crossed his expression that Victoria caught only in fragments, gone too quickly to examine whole. A tightening at the corner of his jaw, a breath drawn in and held a half-second longer than breathing required. Not joy, something closer to a man receiving news he had spent weeks bracing himself to survive, only to discover the bracing hadn't been enough. By the time he turned fully toward her, his face had resolved itself into something calmer, something she read, in the moment, as the quiet relief of a duke whose line had finally been secured. Then it's done, he said. The council will have no further grounds. None. She watched him cross the room toward the hearth, watched his hands find the mantle and grip it with more pressure than the gesture required. You don't seem as settled as I expected. I'm settled. There is simply a great deal to arrange. Legitimacy proceedings, formal acknowledgement, a physician's record entered before witnesses. None of it especially romantic. No, she agreed. I don't suppose any of this was meant to be. He turned then, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to close on its own, without either of them moving. Victoria, whatever I feel in this moment, I want you to understand none of it diminishes what I feel for you. I know. She said it because it was the answer the moment required, not because she had yet examined whether she believed it. And something in his face told her he understood the difference perfectly, and chose, for both their sakes, not to push past it. Night arrived early, the way it always did in deep winter, and Victoria sat by her own fire long after her maid had been dismissed, listening to the house settle into its familiar creaks and silences. The knock, when it came, wasn't a knock at all. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside her door rather than continuing past it toward his own chambers. She understood, before she'd even risen from her chair, that Alexander was standing on the other side of that door, close enough to knock, and choosing not to. She crossed the room slowly and stopped an arm's length from the door, listening. No knock came, no retreat either, only stillness, and beneath it, the sound of a man breathing carefully, the way one breathes when trying not to be heard doing it. Victoria lifted her hand and laid it flat against the wood, the same gesture she had made weeks earlier on the other side of a different door, though this time the wood between them carried no decision waiting to be spoken. Only two people, each aware of the other's nearness, each unwilling to be the one who broke the silence first. She did not call out to him. She did not open the door. She simply stood there, palm against old oak, feeling something on the other side of it that might have been his hand doing the very same thing, and waited to discover which one of them would lose their nerve first. She never learned which of them moved first. At some point past midnight, exhaustion settled the matter that neither of them had been willing to settle through choice. By the time she woke, slumped against her own door, the corridor beyond had gone entirely silent. News of the pregnancy kept no such discretion. By the time the frost on the eastern lawns had begun its slow retreat into something resembling spring, the matter had traveled from the senior maid's careful silence to a stable hand's careless mention, to half the drawing rooms in the county, arriving everywhere dressed in the same polite fiction, that the Duchess of Beaumont's household had been blessed at long last, with an heir. No one asked whose body carried it. Everyone, somehow, already knew. The first formal gathering after the news settled was a modest supper, hosted under the thin pretense of welcoming the new season, though every guest who crossed the threshold understood precisely what they had truly come to witness. Victoria stood beside Alexander in the receiving line, performing gratitude the way she had once performed grief. "Such relief for the house," Lady Caro offered, pressing both of Victoria's gloved hands between her own. "You must be overjoyed, Your Grace." "Overjoyed," Victoria agreed, and found the word required no more effort to produce than any other word in the language, which frightened her more than if it had cost her something visible. Rose stood a careful distance away, dressed in pale rose silk. Victoria watched as Mrs. Witt made her way toward Rose with the slow, deliberate steps of a woman who had decided exactly whom she meant to address. "My dear Lady Bennet." Mrs. Witt's voice carried the particular volume of the partially deaf. "How well you look. The household must be so very proud of you." "Lady Bennet." Victoria heard it from across the room and felt the title land somewhere behind her ribs, with a weight entirely disproportionate to two small words. Rose held no claim to Lady anything. The correction was so obvious, so immediate, that Victoria found herself waiting for it. It did not come. Rose's smile widened, gracious and unhurried. "You're too kind, Mrs. Witt." "The house has been very good to me. No correction, no deflection, only acceptance, dressed so carefully in humility that no one in the room but Victoria seemed to notice the title had simply been allowed to stand. She waited until the guests had gone before she found Rose in the small parlor, still in her rose silk, examining her own reflection in the dark window glass, rather than any mirror. "You let her call you Lady Bennet. She's an old woman with poor hearing and poorer manners. I didn't think it worth the unkindness of correcting her in front of 40 guests. Would you have preferred I embarrassed her? It isn't only the title." Victoria crossed the room, lowering her own voice. "It's the room you moved to without asking. The maid reassigned to you before I'd finished deciding whether she could be spared from my own service. The seat at supper tonight, placed nearer the head of the table than your station has ever required. Small things, Rose, each one small enough to excuse on its own. I find I am running out of room to keep excusing them." For a moment, something flickered across Rose's face that wasn't performed. Not anger exactly, something colder and more deliberate, there and gone before it could be fully read. "I have spent 5 years grateful for every kindness this house gave me, and I have never once asked for more than I was given. I think you might extend me the same patience you'd extend any woman carrying what I'm carrying, rather than counting which chair I sat in. I am not counting chairs for sport. I am watching a pattern, then watch it with less suspicion, and perhaps it will look like what it actually is. I only ever wanted to make myself useful to this house in whatever way it needed me. If that's begun to look like ambition to you, I think that says less about me than it does about how frightened you've become. I only want to understand what's changing between us," Victoria said finally. Rose considered her, head tilted slightly, the firelight catching the edge of her jaw in a way that made her look, briefly, older than her years. "Since you'd rather have it plainly." She moved to the writing desk, opened the drawer without hesitation, and withdrew a slim leather ledger Victoria recognized immediately. The household accounts, the private record that lived, by long custom, only under Victoria's own lock. "I've been reading these in the evenings. There's quite a lot in here I didn't know before. About what it cost to run this house, and who pays for what, and how much of it has always depended entirely on you." She set the ledger down between them. "I thought you'd want to know that I know, before you found the lock broken and wondered who else might have seen it." Victoria took the ledger back without comment, locked it inside a different drawer that night, and said nothing further to Rose about broken locks or borrowed authority. There was no version of the conversation that ended in her favor, and she had learned enough, in 6 weeks of careful arithmetic, to recognize when a hand had already been played out before she'd finished deciding how to respond to it. Alexander knew none of this. He told himself, each time he made the walk down that corridor, that the visits were obligation and nothing more. The trouble was that the visits had stopped feeling like duty somewhere around the 4th week, and he had not yet found the will to examine why. "You're frowning at the window, as though it's personally offended you," Rose said, from where she sat near the hearth with a book open across her lap. "I'm thinking about the eastern boundary dispute. Lord Pelham's tenants have been grazing past the marked line again." "You don't frown like that over sheep." The sound she made wasn't quite a laugh. Something smaller, caught halfway, genuine, in a way that startled him slightly each time he heard it, because it asked nothing of him. Rose laughed the way a person laughs when they've stopped performing for anyone, which made the sound land somewhere unguarded in him before he'd thought to brace against it. He stayed longer than the conversation required. He always did, lately. She asked nothing of him beyond his presence, carried no 5 years of failure folded invisibly into every glance she gave him. He had not realized how exhausting it had become to be a man who was required, everywhere else in his life, to be something. He despised himself for noticing it. The thought arrived most clearly on the nights he walked back to his own chambers alone. A quiet, corrosive certainty that a man bound to a woman who had sacrificed everything to protect their marriage had no right to find comfort in the very any arrangement meant to be her sacrifice, not his reward. Rose, for her part, had begun to notice the length of his visits before he had, and had begun, with a precision that would have unsettled Victoria far more than any ledger, to encourage it. She did not flirt with him outright. She simply made herself easy, never demanding, never burdened, never carrying into the room any of the weight that 5 years of failed expectation had pressed into every corner of his marriage. "You came later tonight," she said, one evening, when the fire had burned low. "I'd nearly given up expecting you." Counsel ran long. Pelham's boundary again. He sat without being invited to, in the chair across from hers that had, somewhere in the last weeks, become understood between them as his. "I won't stay." "You always say that. I mean it more sincerely each time." The smile she gave him then carried something he couldn't quite name. "Then I suppose I'll simply enjoy the time you give me, however much of it that turns out to be." He laughed at that. A real laugh, low and unguarded, the kind he hadn't produced in front of another living soul in longer than he cared to measure. "You're terrible, genuinely terrible. I came to ask about your health and you've turned it into an audience with you." "I've turned nothing into anything. You're the one who stayed." "I'm the one who stayed," he agreed, and the admission, spoken aloud and entirely without defense, settled something in his chest that he didn't examine closely enough to recognize as dangerous. Victoria waited for him in their bedchamber that night, the way she once had every night of their marriage, before waiting had become something she rationed rather than assumed. She had dressed for nothing in particular and told herself she only wanted to ask whether he intended to ride to the northern boundary again this week. He did not come. She heard him in the corridor near midnight, his footsteps slowing as they passed her door rather than stopping at it. He was not deciding whether to come to her. He had already decided, somewhere down the corridor behind him, and the decision had not required her at all. She rose and opened her own door before his footsteps could carry him out of earshot, and found him already several paces past it, his coat still on, his collar still fastened, nothing about him disordered. You're walking the wrong direction for your own chambers." He stopped. For a moment he said nothing, and she watched him choose, visibly, between an honest answer and a convenient one. I looked in on Rose. The physician wanted her watched more closely this week, at midnight. "She doesn't sleep well lately. I thought company might help." "I don't sleep well either." The words left her before she decided whether she wanted him to hear the rawness underneath them. "You haven't thought my company might help in some time." Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly. Something closer to a man realizing, too late, that he had been keeping two separate accountings of his evenings and had just been asked to produce both at once. "Victoria, you don't have to explain it to me tonight." She found she meant it, though the meaning cost her everything she had left standing upright in that doorway. "I would only ask that you stop pretending it requires no explanation at all." She closed the door before he could answer, and stood with her back against it for a long moment, listening for his footsteps to resume. She did not let herself guess which direction, because some nights it was kinder not to know. Victoria came looking for him a little past 9, carrying a question about the spring household accounts that could easily have waited until morning, though she would later admit the question had been little more than an excuse. She had simply wanted to know where he was. The door stood slightly ajar, firelight spilling warm and gold across the corridor floor, and she heard the laughter before she reached the threshold. His laughter, unmistakable even from a distance. Low and easy in a register she hadn't heard from him in longer than she could comfortably count. She arrived at the doorway to find him leaning forward in the chair across from Rose, his hands loose and open in his lap, rather than clasped behind his back, the way duty always arranged them, his face open in a way she hadn't seen since long before the counting began. Rose said something Victoria didn't catch, and Alexander laughed again, fuller this time, the sound filling the small room the way it once, years ago, had filled rooms Victoria stood in. Neither of them looked toward the door. Victoria stood in the threshold, the question about household accounts dissolving into something with no words attached to it at all, watching her husband laugh in a way he had not laughed with her in 5 years, watching the woman she had raised draw that laughter out of him with an ease that looked, from where she stood, less like accident and more like skill. It was Rose who saw her first, over Alexander's shoulder, and whatever passed behind Rose's eyes in that instant resolved itself into an expression so smooth, so immediately composed, that Victoria understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that she had not interrupted anything by accident. She had been allowed to see exactly what she'd seen. Alexander saw her a half-second after Rose did, and whatever composure he'd worn into that room collapsed the moment his eyes found Victoria's in the doorway. He rose too quickly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Victoria, I came about the spring accounts." Her voice held steady, which cost her more than anything else she'd done that night. "It can wait until morning." She left before he could decide whether to follow her, and he didn't. Which told her everything she needed to know about which woman in that house currently held his attention. She went to Rose 3 nights later, once the sting had cooled into something colder and more useful. "You needn't pretend surprise. I think we've both known this was coming since the night you handed me that ledger." "I haven't pretended anything in weeks." Rose didn't rise. She studied Victoria from the chair, with an ease that had nothing deferential left in it. "I wondered how long it would take you to say so plainly." "Then say it plainly to me, whatever this has become." Victoria crossed the room and stood near the hearth. "I raised you. I taught you to read, to dress, to hold yourself in rooms that would have eaten you alive otherwise. I gave you my own husband out of desperation, and I told myself, every single night since, that it was sacrifice rather than betrayal. Tell me now whether I was right." Rose was quiet a long moment, her fingers tracing slow circles over her stomach. You did all of that, and I have never once forgotten it. But I think you've confused kindness with equality, and they were never the same thing. You gave me everything you gave me because it cost you nothing to give it. A girl from nowhere, raised in your shadow, grateful enough never to ask for more than scraps of what you already had in abundance. That isn't sisterhood, Victoria. That's charity with better lighting. That isn't true, and you know it isn't. I know that for 5 years I curtsied to you in rooms where you never once had to curtsy to anyone. I learned French so I could read to you in it. Learned which fork to use so I'd never embarrass you. Learned to make myself small enough to fit into whatever space your kindness left for me. Rose's voice didn't rise. And then you handed me to your husband to save the very position that made all of that necessary. And somehow you still expected my gratitude to outweigh everything that arrangement actually cost me. I never asked you to be grateful. You didn't have to ask. You'd trained me to it long before the question existed. Rose rose now, slowly, and faced Victoria fully, close enough that the fire threw both their shadows long against the same wall. I am carrying the only heir this house will have. I have given up my body, my reputation, whatever future I might have built for myself outside these walls, all so that your marriage could survive a crisis you created the conditions for. I don't think that makes me your enemy, Victoria. I think it simply means the positions have finally turned, and you're discovering what it feels like to need someone more than they need you. I never wanted this to be a war between us, Victoria said. Quieter now. Neither did I. Rose's gaze didn't waver, but I think I've stopped being willing to lose it quietly, the way I once would have. I hope you can understand that, even if you can't yet forgive it. The letter arrived 2 days later, sealed with the unmistakable crest of House Ashworth, delivered to the council rather than to Castellan Hall directly. House Ashworth respectfully petitioned the council to confirm whether the current claimant to the Beaumont heir had been properly and lawfully sanctioned under the kingdom's succession statutes, or whether the child, however genuine its parentage, might be born outside the legal protections such statutes required. They want the throne for Ashworth's daughter, regardless of what's already happened, Alexander said, the letter still in his hand. If they can argue the arrangement was never properly sanctioned, the child's claim collapses no matter whose blood runs through it. Was it ever sanctioned, truly, by law? He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. We moved quickly. Discretion mattered more at the time than procedure. Then they may be right to question it. They're not right to use a child as a weapon in a dispute about land and influence. He set the letter down with more force than the desk required. I will not let Ashworth's ambition undo what's already cost this family everything it has. We'll need to fight this together, Victoria said, whatever else stands unresolved between us. He stopped and looked at her. I would like that, more than I think I've told you. The physician arrived without warning the following evening, his usual measured calm replaced by something tighter, more urgent. He found Alexander in the study and asked, without preamble, for a private word. Your Grace. His eyes moved briefly toward the open door, toward Victoria, who had just appeared. I'd ask that we speak alone. Now, if you're able. Alexander. Her voice caught on his name. What's happened? The physician's jaw set with more care than he'd ever needed to choose his words, and for a long, suspended moment, no one in the room said anything at all. Her blood has begun to carry a heaviness I don't like. He set his case down at last, swelling in her hands and face beyond what the season accounts for. Headaches she's been hiding, by her own admission, longer than she should have. I would not be doing my duty if I let either of you believe otherwise. What does it mean for the child? Alexander's voice had gone low. controlled in the way it always was under pressure. An early labor is possible, perhaps likely, and if it comes early, it may come hard, for mother and child both. I'd ask that she rest entirely now. Whatever this house requires of her, it will have to require it of someone else from this point forward. Victoria felt the words settle into her chest with a weight she hadn't braced for, not relief at the prospect of Rose's diminished influence, which surprised her even as she registered it, but plain, unguarded dread for a girl she had raised since childhood, now carrying a danger no ledger or title could protect her from. I'll tell her myself. Alexander looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him in weeks. Not gratitude exactly, something closer to recognition. For going to her, she's still mine to look after, whatever else has changed. The council session that followed 3 days later had been called, ostensibly, to address routine matters of the spring tariffs, though everyone who entered the chamber understood the true business of the day. Our moment, House Ashworth's representative rose to speak. The council does not question the Duke's right to seek an heir by whatever means his conscience permits, the representative said, his tone smooth and entirely without malice. We question only whether that heir carries the legal protection this kingdom's laws require. Absent proper sanction at the time the arrangement began, House Ashworth respectfully maintains that the matter of succession remains, as a point of law, unresolved. Alexander rose before anyone could second the motion, and Victoria, seated in the gallery, felt the entire room's attention pivot toward him. I will not stand before this council and pretend the arrangement was conducted with the procedural perfection House Ashworth now demands of it. His voice carried across the chamber without rising, which made it carry further than shouting would have. It was conducted in haste, under pressure this very council placed upon me, and I will not apologize for choosing speed over ceremony when the alternative was watching my house dismantled. A murmur moved through the gallery. This motion does not ask whether my heir is legitimate by blood. It asks whether my wife deserves the protection this council once promised her, or whether that protection evaporates the moment a more convenient arrangement presents itself elsewhere. His gaze found Victoria's across the chamber. I have a duchess. I intend to keep her. The vote, when it came, deferred the matter pending formal documentation of the arrangement's sanction. Not victory, but enough delay to breathe, purchased at the cost of House Ashworth's open enmity. He found her afterward in the corridor outside the chamber. You didn't have to choose so openly. I'd already chosen. I simply hadn't said it aloud where it could cost me anything. He took her hand. I'm sorry it took a council chamber and a rival house's ambition to make me say it where you could hear it. She found Rose later that same evening, propped against pillows, her face paler than it had been even during the worst of the morning sickness weeks earlier. I heard about the council, about what he said in there. He chose me, in front of everyone. I'm glad. Rose seemed to mean it entirely. I never wanted to take your marriage from you, Victoria. I wanted, for one moment in my life, to matter as much as you've always mattered. I don't think I understood, until the physician told us what he told us, how much those two once had stopped looking the same. Victoria took Rose's hand. I was angry with you. I think I still am, somewhere underneath this. But I was never not afraid for you. I think I forgot, somewhere in all of this, that you were the only person who ever loved me without first deciding what I could be useful for. I'm sorry for that, truly. We'll have time to mend it properly, once this is past us. Rose offered a faint, tired smile, though something in her eyes carried a flicker of doubt Victoria chose not to examine too closely. I'd like that, more than you know. She had barely finished the thought when her face changed. Suddenly, sharply, a sound caught somewhere between a gasp and a cry, breaking loose from her as her hand released Victoria's grip to press hard against her own stomach. Instead, Rose, something's wrong. Her voice had gone thin, stripped of every careful performance she'd ever built around it. Victoria, something's wrong. It's too early. It's far too early. And beneath her hand, beneath the thin linen of her nightgown, Victoria felt it too. A tightening, sudden and unmistakable, the unmistakable architecture of a body beginning, weeks before anyone had dared to expect it, to give up the child it carried. The household moved with the particular violence of carefully maintained order, breaking all at once. Maids were sent running for the physician before Victoria had finished calling for them. Alexander appeared in the corridor outside Rose's chamber, his face drained of every careful composure he'd built over 5 years of crisis after crisis, and Victoria, passing him on her way back into the room, caught his hand for one suspended second. "Stay out here, whatever happens. This is not a room for you tonight." He nodded, his jaw set hard enough that she could see the muscle working beneath his skin, and let her go. Inside, Rose had gone pale enough that the candlelight made her look almost translucent, her hands gripping the edge of the bed frame with a strength that left white marks against her own knuckles. The physician worked with quiet urgency, the kind of calm a man only manages when he has decided panic is a luxury neither of them can afford. "Far too early," he said, more to himself than to either woman in the room, though his hands never stopped moving. "But the child is positioned well enough. We'll manage this. Lady Bennet, I need you to listen to my voice, and nothing else." Victoria knelt at the head of the bed, taking Rose's hand in both of hers. "Look at me. Not the door, not the window. Me." "I'm frightened, Victoria." The words came stripped of every performance Rose had ever built around herself. "I don't want to die in this room. You won't. I won't let you." Victoria pressed her forehead briefly to the back of Rose's hand, an old gesture from childhood neither of them had used in years. "You're going to meet this child, and you're going to be furious with me again within the month for something small and ordinary, and I am going to be glad of it. Do you hear me?" Rose laughed, thin and broken at the edges, and held onto Victoria's hand through the hours that followed, even as the pain climbed past anything either of them had words ready for. The child arrived just past 2 in the morning, small and furious, and entirely, miraculously alive, a girl with a cry loud enough to carry past the chamber door into the corridor. Victoria heard Alexander exhale, a single, broken sound, and felt her own chest loosen. It did not last. The physician's expression changed almost the instant the child was settled into a waiting nurse's arms, his attention snapping back to Rose, with a sharpness that made Victoria's relief curdle instantly into a different kind of fear. Rose had gone grey, her grip on Victoria's hand suddenly slack rather than fierce. "She's bleeding more than she should. Fetch me everything in my case. Now, quickly." Victoria did not let go of Rose's hand, even as the room filled with motion around them, even as Rose's eyes closed and did not immediately reopen. "Rose, stay with me. Stay with me, please." The physician's face, when he finally glanced up at her, said far more than the careful, measured words he chose. "I'm doing everything I know to do, Your Grace. The next hour will tell us a great deal." The hour that followed felt longer than the 5 years that had preceded it. Victoria stayed at the bedside through all of it, her gloved hands long since discarded somewhere on the floor, her bare fingers wrapped around Rose's. Outside the door, Alexander kept his own vigil, the mirror image of the night the arrangement had begun, except this time it was the women bound together on one side of a closed door and the man left to wait, helpless, on the other. Rose's color began to return sometime past 3. her breathing settling into something steadier. By the time the first grey light crept through the curtains, the physician sat back, his shoulders dropping with visible exhaustion. "She'll live," he said. I believe that now, with some confidence. It was closer than I would have liked to admit while it was happening. Victoria pressed her face briefly against Rose's hand and wept without trying to stop it. It took 3 days before Rose was strong enough to speak at length. Victoria found her sitting up against the pillows with the child asleep in a small cradle beside the bed. Her face still pale, but her eyes clearer than Victoria had seen them in months. I thought I understood what I wanted. Influence. A title with some weight behind it. Proof that I mattered as much as anyone born into this house, rather than raised inside its shadow. She let one finger rest against the child's tiny hand, and then I came close enough to dying that none of it felt like it had ever mattered at all. I only wanted to live long enough to see her grow, and I wanted, her voice caught, I wanted you beside me when I thought I might not. I was beside you. I'll stay beside you. Even after everything I said to you, everything I let myself become. You didn't become anything I don't understand the shape of, Rose. I gave you a wound and called it a gift. And you did with it exactly what any frightened, ambitious person does with power they've never been allowed to hold before. I forgive you. I think I forgave you somewhere in that room 3 nights ago, long before either of us had the strength to say so. Rose's eyes filled. I don't deserve it so easily. Then earn it slowly, if it eases your conscience. We have time now. We didn't before. House Ashworth's claim collapsed within the week. Not through any new evidence the council weighed, but through the simple, irreversible fact of Rose's own willing testimony, a signed statement, given freely, confirming the arrangement had been her choice, and asking the council to recognize her daughter's legitimacy under whatever formal sanction the Duke now wished to provide retroactively. Without an unwilling party to exploit, Ashworth's representatives withdrew their motion before the council could vote it down outright. Alexander signed the formal documentation himself, naming his daughter heir to the Beaumont line. It was, by any measure the court understood, a victory. It did not feel, to Victoria, like the part of the story that mattered most. She found Alexander alone that evening, in the same study where he had once told her about his father's house. He stood near the same window, less braced, less armored than he'd been that night. A man who had spent a great deal of fear and grief in the last week, and had nothing left over for performing composure he didn't feel. You've signed the documents. This morning. It's done. Properly this time. He turned from the window, and the look on his face stopped her where she stood. Victoria, I need to say something to you, and I find I no longer have the patience to wait for the correct occasion to say it. Then say it. I spent 5 years believing patience was the same thing as love. That if I never raised my voice, never let the court's cruelty become my own, I was somehow honoring what I felt for you, even while I let you carry every weight of our failure alone. He crossed the room toward her, his storm-gray eyes holding hers without flinching. I was wrong. Patience without presence is only another kind of absence, and I left you alone in this marriage for longer than I have any right to ask forgiveness for. I love you, Victoria. Not the duty of you, not the title of you. You, exactly as you are, exactly as you've been through every part of this that nearly broke us both. Victoria felt something long held finally loosen in her chest. An old, careful architecture of composure she had built specifically to survive a marriage that had, for years, given her so little to lean against. I have loved you since before I understood what loving someone honestly would cost me, she said. I think I gave you Rose, in part, because I was too frightened to discover what would happen to this marriage if I simply let it fail on its own terms. without a desperate solution standing between us and the truth. I don't regret protecting what we built. I regret, terribly, that I let fear choose the method instead of trusting you enough to choose it together. Then let us choose together, from this point forward, whatever comes, together, she agreed, and let him close the last small distance between them, his hand finding her face the way it had outside her chambers months earlier, except now there was no debt neither of them could afford, no grief held carefully at arm's length, only two people who had survived a war neither had fully understood they were fighting, choosing, at last, to stop fighting each other for what remained. The chapel bells at Castellan Hall rang differently in spring than they had in the deep winter Victoria remembered most clearly from the years before, brighter, less burdened by the cold that had always made every sound in this house feel like it traveled through glass. Victoria stood near the font in pale gold silk rather than morning white, her hair still arranged in the same fixed knot she had worn through every difficult season, though something in her bearing had loosened in the months since the birth. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting at the small of her back in a way that no longer felt like a man steering furniture through a crowded room. It felt, now, like a man who simply wanted to remain close. The infant in the priest's arms had stopped fussing the moment the cool water touched her forehead, blinking up at the chapel's high ceiling, with an expression of such serious, owlish confusion that a ripple of quiet laughter passed through the assembled family. Eleanor Rose Beaumont, the priest's voice carried easily through the stone chamber. Named before God and this household, Victoria felt Alexander's hand press fractionally firmer against her back at the sound of the middle name, and she didn't need to look at him to know he was thinking of the same conversation she was. The quiet evening, weeks earlier, when she'd suggested it herself, and watched something complicated move behind Rose's eyes before settling into something simple, unguarded gratitude. Rose stood a short distance from the font, in pale rose silk, as she always had been, though the dress itself had changed in small, telling ways. Finer lace at the cuffs, a single strand of pearls at her throat that hadn't been there a year before. Gifts Victoria had insisted upon, rather than concessions Rose had quietly claimed for herself. She held no formal title the court's records would ever properly capture, but everyone in the chapel that morning understood exactly what she was. Not handmaiden, not rival, but something simpler and harder one. Godmother to the child she had carried, and family to the household that had nearly lost itself trying to protect what it already had. "Will you accept this charge?" the priest asked her. "To guide and guard this child in faith, should her parents one day be unable?" "I will." Rose's voice didn't waver. "Gladly. For as long as I live." The ceremony continued in its old familiar rhythms, but Victoria found her attention drifting toward the man beside her rather than the ritual itself. Alexander watched his daughter with an expression she had never once seen on him in 5 years of marriage. Nothing held back, nothing measured for an audience, simply a father undone by the smallness of a hand curled around the priest's finger. When the ceremony finished, and the small crowd began the slow migration toward the reception laid out in the garden, Rose lingered near Victoria for a moment, the child now settled against her own shoulder. "She has your eyes," Rose said. "Did you notice? Not his. Yours. She has yours. Around the mouth, when she frowns." Victoria reached out and smoothed one small curl away from the infant's forehead. "I think she's claimed a little of all three of us, in the end. I think that's rather the point of her." Rose's smile carried nothing guarded in it anymore. "I owe you a debt I don't think I'll ever finish repaying, Victoria. You owe me nothing further. You already gave me everything that mattered. The night you said yes to something that frightened you more than either of us admitted at the time. Victoria pressed a brief kiss to the crown of Rose's head. Go and enjoy the garden. I imagine half the court is already gossiping about your dress. Rose laughed and carried the child off toward the waiting nurse, leaving Victoria alone for a moment at the edge of the emptying chapel. Alexander found her there, the last of the guests already drifting out into the spring sunshine. You're not joining the garden yet, he said. I wanted a moment first. I think I needed to stand somewhere quiet and remember how close we came to losing all of it, before I let myself enjoy having it. He stepped closer, near enough now that she could feel the warmth of him, without either of them performing the careful distance that had governed so much of their marriage, and reached for her hand, his fingers finding the edge of her satin glove and working it loose from her wrist with unhurried care. Alexander. She glanced toward the open chapel doors, toward the garden beyond, where half the court still lingered. Someone will see. I find I no longer mind who sees. He drew the glove free entirely, let it fall, forgotten, onto the stone floor between them, and pressed his lips to the bare skin of her palm. I spent 5 years guarding every part of how I felt for you, Victoria, because I believed restraint was the same thing as dignity. I don't believe that any longer. I would rather the entire court watch me love my wife plainly than spend one more season pretending I don't. Her laugh, when it finally came, carried nothing of the composure she had worn through every difficult room of the last 5 years. It carried out through the open chapel doors into the spring garden beyond, where no one thought to question why the Duke and Duchess of Beaumont had lingered so long behind everyone else, only smiled at the sound of it, and understood that something in that house had finally, fully, come home. Thank you for watching until the final page. Every Duke, every Duchess, every quiet heartbreak, they only live because you're here listening. Subscribe so you never miss the next one.